so much of the whole magic system is based on using, or at least Kai's version of the magic system is using your own pain as a weapon. That doesn't, and he talks one point that doesn't particularly get rid of it. It just means you were able to do something with it. It doesn't mean you don't feel it.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fandy Show.
The spiffiest show in the know.
All right, that's great. I'm Sean.
I'm Sandra.
And tonight, we're joined for the second time this year by the amazing and generous Martha Wells. Welcome back to the show, Martha.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
This is exciting because I've never got to talk to you about your fantasy, and that's where we're going to be talking about some of that today. And I have questions. So for those that don't know, because I don't know, you're living under a rock maybe, but Martha Wells is the best-selling, acclaimed author of SFF works, including the books of the Raksura series, the Ilran series, the Murderbot Diaries series, and other novels, including 2023's Witch King, whose sequel we are talking about today just came out, I believe, last month, Queen Demon.
Okay, and before we get into our discussion, a reminder to our listeners to please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. If you aren't already, join us on Twitch for Sean's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central to be a part of our interactive live streaming show format. Finally, be sure to review and spread the word about our show, help support us through our Patreon, and be part of our torture cinema polls, live watches, and other special Patreon-only events on Discord.
Perfect. So Martha, this might be a hard starter question, because normally we would ask this question when it's like the first book, but this is a second book. And so I'd like to start by having you just tell us a little bit about this book. But it might be difficult because there may be spoilers you don't want to reveal.
Yeah. It basically starts off not too long after Witch King ends, and in the present timeline, and is basically following up on some bits and pieces that were introduced in Witch King, and then the rest of the conspiracy, as I try frantically to think about anything that is not a spoiler. And then in the past timeline, you're seeing more of basically the relationships between the characters growing, and as they really get into starting the war against the hierarchs.
Yeah. I think it would not be spoilery, because you just mentioned it, that you continue the dual timeline that you had in Witch King, right? In Queen Demon. So I have read and heard that you write as you go. You don't outline necessarily. So how did you write the dual timeline? Did you do one at a time, or you really could just write flashbacks as you went along the draft?
Yeah, that's basically what I did with Witch King. I started out as just going to be a couple of flashbacks, and I got to the scene where the flashback where Kai is in the cageling demon court right before Bishasa rescues him. And I realized that scene was doing so much heavy lifting of the backstory. And I really needed to go back and realized I needed more flashbacks and showing what Kai's life was like with the Soretti before the war started, and then what happened to them when they mounted a very successful campaign against the hierarchs and then were crushed. And I needed to show, and these are just little brief snippets. And then when I got back to the Kai in the cageling demon court and Bishasa, and I just really got into that story of how they had escaped. I thought, well, I'm just going to continue this. And that's kind of how I wrote Queen Demon too, is just kind of following the characters and, thinking about what would be the next cool thing to happen. What do I want to write about? And that's done me well so far.
Yeah, so impressive.
Well, thank you.
Another thing kind of related to thinking structure, one of the things I noticed, because most recently I had read some of the Murderbot Diaries, works in preparation, right, for the interview we had done with you then, rereading All Systems Red and so on. And those are novellas, and so there's a length is probably a part of this. But one thing I really noticed is that the chapters in Murderbot are fairly tight. They're fairly short, kind of punchy, and even somewhat the writing style is a little bit different. Whereas in this book, and this is not a criticism, this is just acknowledgement, this book, your chapters are much more developed and dense. There's a lot of very slow character movements. Obviously, there's world building components and other things. So your chapters are much thicker in terms of their content. And I'm curious if that is more to do with the genre you're writing in, or if that's kind of how the story developed for you, or kind of where that difference for you kind of emerged.
With the chapters, the actual length of the chapters, usually when I write Murderbot, it's just one long thing, and my editor makes me divide it up into chapters. So that's why those are pretty tight. And but with Witch King and Queen Demon, I think in Witch King I had to take a couple of chapters and divide them in half. But it's part of the point of view, and Murderbot does not describe hardly anything. It's just not that interested in things. It does describe things it's interested in doing more the third person personal in Witch King and Queen Demon. That necessitates a lot more description of just moving the characters through the space and everything. And it's kind of the genre, because that's one thing I really like about fantasy is making the kind of this alien world feel very textured and real, and giving the the reader little spots of color and that fill in this landscape.
I figured genre had an element of that because of some of the typical requirements of like epic fantasy in particular. But I was just really curious about that. I'm now suddenly we're not going to talk about it, but because it's about a different book series. But now I'm very curious about the Murderbot development of how we get to those tinier chapters. But I think you raise a really interesting point, which is this idea that the character point of view has an impact on what kinds of details might be given to us, right? Murderbot very much in Murderbot's mindset. And so, as you say, Murderbot doesn't care about a lot of things, so those don't get really described to us, or if they do, they're very cursory. Whereas in this, the perspective, as you point out, there are things that have to be relayed to the reader to give us a sense of things. Characters have, emotional resonances and components and thoughts, and there's different ways in which you present communication in this, which is another thing I was going to ask about in later. So it's so interesting just to see how much your writing shifted is quite different between these two. It's the same author. I know that because the voice is still there, but it is very different writing. And I don't know if you noticed that in yourself as you were kind of working on these works, if you noticed how you write these stories or the way they sound, the character development, those kind of things came across to you as you were writing?
Oh yeah, definitely. And it also, particularly because Murderbot is in first person, so it's very different from the way I normally write. Because Witch King and Queen Demon are a lot closer to the way I normally write. Basically, I've always felt, and this is how I read, the reader's only interested in not necessarily the things that are happening, but how the characters feel about what's happening. And so getting that across is it's much easier in first person than it is in third person personal. And that's what makes you really kind of sink into the book, and the character point of view is how the characters feel about what they see. Why did they describe what they describe? What's important to them and what's not. So that all goes into it.
That brings up for me the themes, because you're writing from Kai's POV and in both novels. And I was really drawn to how you're dealing with the themes of colonization and decolonization in both of the novels. So were those themes already baked into the premise for you, or did they just kind of come up for you organically as you were writing?
I think they're baked into the premise, because the original idea of this was after a major war that had nearly destroyed all these civilizations in this area, and just the effect on the characters who had lived through it, and the repercussions even for the people who have been born after it are just continuing. And so the idea of the colonization and what the hierarchs actually wanted to do to them was very much, part of the original idea. I had been thinking about, just some from different things I'd read, fiction and nonfiction, is what our world might look like if, the mass colonization of so much, I don't know if it's like 99% of the world or something that happened,
Mm.
had not happened. And also what the ancient world looked like before we get into this colonization era. And even with the different wars that went on in basically in prehistory and everything, just how different it would look. And obviously that's a scope that's really hard to show. So this was and that's not really something I wanted to write the whole thing of. So I kind of thought
Yeah.
of King and Queen Demon as an epic fantasy, the good parts version, mostly where it's the decisions that their characters made that caused these momentous changes and movements and everything, without showing you all the armies moving around and all that kind of stuff.
Right, right. I mean, and bringing that huge scope down to the human scale, right? Or demon scale? Do I, and I was surprised, like with all of the world building, it just feels so rich. And I know that you've said in other interviews, like you want to leave spots for readers' imaginations to go on their own, right? So you don't want to limit your world. So I was so surprised to hear or read that Witch King was originally a standalone. And I assumed that you were of a stature that you would be getting multi-book deals. So was it being a standalone? Was that your preference?
I just didn't know if I would want to continue the story.
Oh,
And because especially in that first book, you're first meeting these characters, and it's like, how much of the story do I want to tell? And I think I've talked about that, in the past. I can't plot out a series because there would be absolutely no guarantee that I could sell more than one or two books of a series. And so you don't want to start a really long story and then just have to drop it because you can't find a publisher for the rest of it. And but with this one, it was like the first book of a 6-book contract. And though when I started writing it, I didn't know that was what was going to happen. So I was kind of doing my usual thing, I think, of trying to bring it to a close, but there were so many the original idea I had, we only got about halfway there in Witch King. And and we didn't get much further into it in Queen Demon. So hopefully I can bring it all together in the third book and finish it. But and usually I think about, well, I want, especially with fantasy worlds that are really cool to make up, I wanted to take the reader to these places, and then usually I don't really get there by the first book, and then that's when I start wanting to write more.
right. I'm just making prayer hands because I loved both books so much. And I'm so excited there's a third one.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely was planning a third one because in Queen Demon, again, I knew I wasn't going to get to the end of the whole idea for the original story.
Yeah. And what a way to end. Oh my Lord.
Shh.
I know. I'm not, that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
Could I back up just a little bit, because we were talking about the theme of colonization, and one of the things that really stood out to me in this book, I think it's Ziti that says it, or it might be just Kai remembering people saying something to the effect, but there's a moment, I think, in one of the past narratives where this idea of like capitulating to the hierarchs comes up, and the kind of different rhetoric that surrounds that idea. Some people saying like, no, you must reject all of that and fight absolutely. Some sort of saying, well, no, maybe if we just give a little bit, they'll kind of stop. And others kind of pointing out that there's maybe a flaw there, which is there's a sarcastic comment, which is the comment I'm thinking of sort of this idea that, well, if you give in, right, all of the other things they have done, all the extermination and killing and taking, etc., well, now they'll just stop, right? Because we've finally given up enough that they're satisfied. And a part of that idea is this the assumption that you know what their motivation is, which I think throughout the book at various points, sometimes that motivation is not always in like explicitly clear to characters, or sometimes that motivation might be a little bit different than we expect. But I love this idea that you've woven into here of trying to think about the consequences of being on the other side of a colonization and what the appropriate response is, and like really thinking through the logic of what that appropriate response is. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about kind of, thinking about the other side of that coin, not taking the perspective of the colonizer, but actually thinking about the people that are having to like deal with the consequences of that and make decisions about what to do about it at great cost.
Yeah, because Witch King, I started it after the first 6 months of the first 6 months of the COVID pandemic, when we were still kind of in lockdown, and before we had vaccines. And so things were bad, and looking like they were just going to get worse. And so a lot of it came out for me of thinking about what it would be like to see your world destroyed, the place where you lived all this time. And so kind of using that perspective, and also thinking about what it would be like when you're just living in your civilization, and suddenly these people come from, no, you don't even know where they came from, they're just there suddenly now, and bent on destruction and taking over. And just trying to, I think the COVID pandemic made that point a little bit easier to see, of seeing your world destroyed, and how that would feel. And also other political things going on at the time certainly played into it, of basically seeing the world destroyed for no apparent reason. And it's not explicit in the books yet, but there's a lot of different hierarchs, and so they don't know what all their motivations are. Expecting any large group of people to have one single motivation is not really the way it works in reality. So the Ariki and the Analan and the others just know they're being attacked, but they don't always know. There's people who want to capitulate, and people who have been offered deals, like the Ariki originally were, and think that they could take that deal. But again, it's like, is that deal? They have absolutely no motivation to keep up their side of the bargain, of any bargain they make with the Ricky and the others, because they don't really consider them people. So it's just a lot of thinking about all those kinds of things goes into it, and finding a place to put a lot of my own feelings about what was going on in the world at the time, basically.
There must
Yeah.
also be an aspect there of, you kind of mentioned earlier, like thinking about the history as well, because some of what you're describing, like reneging on treaties, etc., are literally things that happen during pretty much every colonizing effort. And I'm not saying you're doing that as like I'm doing a one-to-one like allegory per se. Yeah, but
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you look at it, is how the same tactics are used over and over again. I'm thinking about how it went with the Native Americans in the U.S. and North America, versus how it went with the British in India, and what they did there. And just, and just thinking about, it's a situation we all kind of live with. We've all kind of grown up in that world, and yet it's so horrific to really think about what happened. And yeah, it's just not, it's I don't know, I've been reading about this for a long time, and I think it's just kind of like bubbling to the surface. And also a lot of personal anger being put into this book, and yeah, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, for me, part of why I just am so enjoying this series is that there's this thread of heartbreak throughout both books. And that is in such large part, I think, to those themes of colonization, and then the hard work and the cost that goes into decolonization. And also the fact that essentially Kai, Zidi, Tyren, and Dahin are basically refugees, right? And that is already a heartbreaking situation. There is nothing for Kai to go back to. And that underlines everything and all of the choices that he makes, and, his found family, they all make. And I personally am that weirdo that loves heartbreak in in the things that I read. I want to be moved that way. I'm also a writer, and that's what I try and write. That's what moves me and interests me, is how do people in extreme circumstances, how do characters, how do they deal with that heartbreak that's just there, and there's no going back to change the situation which causes it. And I really enjoy that about both these books. And also in all the Murderbot books for me, I feel that too in regard to Murderbot, the character. So, yeah, anyway, that was an observation. That was not a question. I'm sorry.
Well, it's the angst. I love angst too. Um, I like happy endings. I like a lot of angst before we get to the happy ending. But
Yeah.
and kind of with Witch King, and in Witch King, you know that they were successful in the past timeline. You just don't know if they're going to be able to hold on to it in the present timeline. And I like what you said about them all being refugees, because it's very true. Because Kai basically, he lost the world he was born into during this, and he also lost the world that he had grown up in. So it's and then they're the fact that they're so very long lived compared to the normal humans. Yeah, it's they're not in a great situation. And that was kind of a thing. I think I've read a lot about, the immortals who kind of don't care. And like Twilight and the immortal vampire that's still going to high school like 200 years later or whatever. And there's no moving on. And the immortals in this book do care and are moving on, but it's also incredibly painful, and that you eventually, the people you love die, and you have to keep going, and you kind of keep having to going and doing your
Yeah.
job when with these changes happening around you.
This is a good time for a Paul question, because I think this bounces right into one of his questions, because he was curious about the evolution of the Kai Dahin relationship in the earlier present timeframes, and the importance of that relationship in helping drive character development and narrative.
Yeah, because I think in Queen Demon you see a little bit more of how Kai was actually one of the people who raised Dahin, that he was a teenager. Kai wasn't too much older, but the way demons experience, maturation is really kind of different. It depends a lot on the body they're in. So, and Dahin was basically this teenage boy who was like somewhat precocious and having this hard time. And so they went from Kai basically being, an adult figure who was helping to raise him, to his friend. So that's in some ways it's kind of a bit of a tricky relationship, particularly as Dan has had these problems, and Kai and Zeddy really have no idea, and Taran certainly too, what to do about it. And Dan's very much affected by the things that happened to him, there and the way he was treated by his family and everything else. And it's really caused him to be somewhat, part of the family while also being somewhat estranged from it. We're part of the found family. So, yeah, it's a really interesting relationship to play with.
Kind of a follow up to that, which Paul has questions about a little bit more about Dahin's story as being one of obsession and compulsion. And I guess his real question is, can you discuss the evolution of his story to the narrative, which you've kind of started on? But one of the things he says here is there's a comparison being made to him being very different from Kai and Zeddy in particular.
Yeah, because Dahin does tend to get obsessed with things in ways that Kai and Zeddy don't.
Yeah.
Kai and Zeddy have survived basically by being able to let go of a lot of baggage. I mean, someone had talked about that the books are basically about weaponized trauma, and they've had to let go of trauma and issues as they go along. And the Blessed are very much kind of built different. And though Dahin is in a lot of ways sort of like trying to reject or repudiate his upbringing and everything as a Blessed, he still is one. But he does get obsessed about stuff to the point where, and it's not just academic obsession, it's obsession about other things. And he's kind of a bit of a mirror for Hyson in Queen Demon, and that's going to come up a lot more in the third book.
Dun dun dun.
Maybe that's what separates the Blessed from other people, is this inability to just let stuff go, let other people
Mm.
be other people, and that kind of thing.
That's
Um,
interesting, because this is a conversation that has come up in my science fiction class because we were reading Tobias Bickel's Ragamuffin, and at the end of that book, there's a very significant moment where a character is basically given the opportunity to commit basically genocide, to get vengeance against people who have done horrible things to his people, killed his son, all of these horrible things, and he chooses not to do that. Chooses to warn them of what's coming, that there's a virus coming to kill them, etc., and he's going to save them. And when you'd mentioned this story as being, one somewhat about trauma and people not letting that go and struggling to let that go, it made me wonder how could you have some sort of an epic fantasy with this much war and violence and destruction that isn't in some way about the trauma that the people who survive that have to now deal with on a day-to-day basis? I mean, how could you write a story that doesn't have that, I suppose?
Yeah, I don't know, because so much of the whole magic system is based on using, or at least Kai's version of the magic system is using your own pain as a weapon. It doesn't, and he talks one point that doesn't particularly get rid of it. It just means you were able to do something with it. It doesn't mean you don't feel it. So it's such an important. Well, I think probably one of the other themes of the book is how long it takes you to kind of get past your trauma. Because we know it takes, in reality, it takes people, a traumatic moment may only last a few minutes, but can take you months, years to to actually get over it, actually process it and deal with it. And in Witch King and Queen Demon in the present day timeline, we're seeing an entire group of civilizations that are still processing and dealing with trauma, even and it's almost the ones that have been born since then that didn't see it firsthand are still the ones who have to process and deal with it, because it's their legacy. Basically, it's kind of like having, a parent with PTSD. You weren't there for the traumatic event, but you're dealing with it in a lot of ways just as much as they are. Yeah, it's just I guess there's basically, there's not any one grand theme of the book. There's just a lot of basically things intertwined about how different people deal with with trauma, and the way some people are able to weaponize it and use it and move on, and some people are stuck in it. And I guess Bashasa is pretty much
Oh,
the standard of, basically fighting your way through it. And, because he was not a particularly ambitious person, but what he wanted was a return to some kind of normality. And he basically took everybody else with him on that journey. Some of them were, whether they wanted to go or not.
I love Bashasa, and I'm glad you brought him up because it now gets me to ask the question I wanted to ask. Because there's a small narrative in the story. It's not one of the major sort of plot components of it, but more of like a personal subplot, which is Bashasa's love of a certain beverage. And there's a great moment in it where Kai confronts him about it, and I thought there's so much characterization in that, and the way that Bashasa reacts and how Kai reacts, and there's a little bit of like trying to use words to get through it, but realizing it's not gonna succeed because Kai is like very firm and you need to know you can't have this back. And I wanted to kind of ask about vices. I feel like are a way that sometimes people deal with these things, and Bashasa is such a great example of one who has vices, perhaps many of them. The drinking thing is just perhaps one of them. And it seems to me that that's also an important point, that a lot of characters in this have their own sort of little hang-ups that they have to kind of work through. Bashasa is just the one I'm glad you raised because I really like Bashasa.
Yeah, and I thought that was, I mean, normally for alcoholism is such a terrible problem for a human person to deal with, but immortal demons see it as much more simple. As I mean, a human could spend untold hours trying to get Bashasa not to drink. It's much easier for Kai.
I actually wanted to maybe pull back the focus a little bit and ask more about your writing process. I promised some writer nerd questions. So, excuse me. So I have read that you've said that extrapolating tech into the future is really difficult, which I agree with. So how do you handle technology in a fantasy setting, and specifically in these Rising World novels? For example, you have the Ascension rafts that the Blessed have, which are, it's pretty techy. They're aircraft, but you make them run on magic. But like, how do you decide what's going to be kind of high tech and magic and what's going to be low tech?
Yeah, it's fun playing with technology in fantasy novels because people seem to have this idea that there's no technology in fantasy novels, and it's like anything that's a tool is technology. So unless your people are running around naked in the forest with nothing, and they probably have some tools. In the books of the Raksura, I made a lot of the technology organic, which was really fun to do, which kind of gave you the feeling of a world that had just developed in a different way. In this world, it's about power sources, and they have different magical power sources that different people can use in different ways. And when I was kind of developing the idea of the blessed as I went along, it feels like they can funnel their power into this technology, and so their way of living is like easier than a lot of the other groups around them who have to rely on like water power or something like that, who have to have lots harder, have trying to get food and everything like that. Their technology is more lower tech, which makes the blessed feel very superior and contributes to why they are like they are, basically. But and a lot of it is just thinking about if you have this power source, what else can you do with it? Somebody said one time that in my books, people don't just like find magical objects or whatever. It's like you have to do research and development to build the magical object. And I think that's a lot more fun. It's also mirrors, I think, the way we develop technology. But yeah, just kind of thinking about where the different power sources come from and what the culture that developed that or that has that source, what they would do with it.
Yeah. Well, okay, this is related. Am I right in remembering that you have a degree in anthropology? Is that right? Yeah. Great. So I would guess, I mean, do you think there's any specific aspect of having studied anthropology that influences the way that you world build? It sounds like it because you talk about cultures and sort of the logical progression of technology, but could you speak on that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think it very definitely helped me because just studying different cultures and also realizing that looking at cultures that were not necessarily attacked from outside, but basically came up with stuff that destroyed them, either ideas or practices or rituals or whatever that turned out to be more destructive than anything else. And we see that all the time as cultures are continually developing stuff that they shouldn't develop. And it's kind of the way cultures are continuously changing and growing, and trying to get that into fantasy instead of having worlds that feel very static.
Hmm.
Like they've just, you would see a lot of that, I think, in, I don't want to call it classic fantasy, but maybe the old pulp fantasy, where these massive cities in the desert that just kind of it feels like nothing has changed. It just got to this certain point and then stopped. And that's not the way anything works in involving human culture. The way their religion seems to be the same. It's like, there's it feels like religions change every 2 weeks. I mean, they just develop different stuff, and it's like there's no way you're going to have these people worshiping the same God for 1,000 years, because we have, 1,000 year occupation sites and cultures where you can literally see, especially like in Egypt, or where you can see all the different changes in the religion and the way things morphed into other different things. And so, yeah, all of that really helps, and it really helps to look at that and to realize that reality is a million times more complicated than most of the anything you can come up with in fantasy, no matter how complex it is. And so, yeah, I thought it was a great help to me.
That's so cool.
Is there like you mentioned this, I think a great point, which is like the real world is incredibly complicated, but there's only so much you can get into a book before people start to ask questions. Uh, and so, is there as you're writing and kind of developing your worlds in these fantasy works, is there some sort of logic or a point at which you go, these are the kinds of parts of that I'm going to focus on, and then I'm not going to spend terribly much time on a lot of these other components, or is it kind of organic for you?
It's kind of more organic, but a lot of it has to do with the story the characters are moving through or telling, to concentrate on the things that's important for that. Because if it's not part of the story you're telling, finding places to talk about it is kind of difficult. And also, it's not as relevant to the reader, so they're not as likely to remember it. So it's not going to help impact the story. One of the most fun things I think is coming up with something for the book and changing your mind, but kind of leaving it in there as an aside, and then 500 pages later, you're like, oh, I can use that thing. That's
Yeah.
perfect for me. And that kind of organic development is what I like the best, actually.
There's an element
Yeah,
of that
that's
of
fun.
like sometimes you put things in there that don't seem like they might have a purpose other than they're meaningful to a character, perhaps, but maybe later they will be.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You never know. You're kind of, and you're just kind of leaving little breadcrumbs for yourself that you might come stumble on and come back and stumble on and be able to like make an important part of the plot. And it just
Yeah.
feels very organic, like it's always been there. Well, it was, it just didn't always know what we were going to do with it.
Yeah. I love those moments. It's like for me in my mind, it's the A-team gif of Hannibal saying, I love it when a plan comes together. Like that's what pops up.
Yeah, it's like I love it when the plan I didn't know I made comes
Yeah,
together.
exactly.
Can I ask a magic related question? Because there's a lot of different sort of types of magic here, and the one that I was really fascinated by was the intentions, which there's a
Mhm.
bunch of different moments where Kai is like trying to compress them, structure them to figure out how they work and what they are, so that he can then use them. And the name of them I just found so interesting because I kept forgetting that it's magic and not like literally someone's intention manifested in reality. Now, so maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of developing the intentions and how they kind of worked in the world.
Yeah, they're basically spells, but I wanted to make them different in spells because it is the intention of the person who is putting it together. And so it's not necessarily built of like, spell components of like I need Eye of Newt or whatever, but it's built of these basically weaponized emotions almost of the intent of, and they're all the pretty much all the intentions they encounter are not are basically about killing someone or hurting someone. They don't really, there's some that they can do that's like to warn them if something's happening in a place, but most of them are built on a very simple need on the part of the person who's doing it. I want to hurt this person in this way. And that's kind of why I gave them a different name because they're not really like spells in a lot of ways. They're different. And trying to figure out and watching Kai try to figure them out is what they're basically is like feeling your way through this really murky, horrible thing of these different you know, bad intentions. So yeah, that's kind of what I was going for there. And also I think it helps in a fantasy like this to try to give unconventional names to your concepts because you want it to feel different and you don't want to give people just a stock generic image. You want them to kind of think about what this really means and what it really looks like. Giving it a different name, I think, helps with that.
I agree.
Um, well, speaking of like how we see Kai in the past and in the like contemporaneous action of the present day, and how he has to learn to pull apart and learn all of the magic that he's clearly a master of in the present day, it made me think of how do you purposefully set up obstacles like technological or magical obstacles in your fantasy and sci-fi to force your characters to work around them?
Not really intentionally, but when I'm kind of like going through the story and I come up with something, it's like, oh, it'll be really cool if they could do this. How does that work? How does that make sense in the world? And then sometimes since you're building the world at the time, you get to go back and change things a little bit to make it work. But just trying to keep everything internally consistent so it feels right. And like once in Witch King, you have the idea of the power wells. It's like, okay, well, they can build this kind of power well with death or pain, but you could also probably build it with other things, which is what the Well of Thesaurus is. And and then taking the way you've kind of set that up and saying, well, how would this work? And how would I be able to do it? And the present or the past timeline is really fun for that because that's when you're seeing a lot of him first figuring out just how to use his sort of innate power as a demon in these different ways that the mortals and the other immortals use the power sources that are available to them.
Yeah, that's so cool.
So I want to ask one last one from Paul, and then I think we got to kind of start our wind down, because otherwise you'll be here forever, because Paul will ask 30 more questions. So Paul had I think a question that kind of, we almost got to it at the very beginning, but we kind of moved along. But, for a period of time, you'd written quite a number of science fiction tales, and then, gone to fantasy, and now coming back to this epic fantasy. And Paul's question is about that transition. What would it kind of feel like to kind of shift back from these science fiction stories and a very different writing and so on, and to, these much more lavish in terms of their detail epic fantasies, returning that epic fantasy world. What was that transition like for you?
It was kind of a relief in a lot of ways because I've always loved fantasy and going back to it after I guess about 3 years of writing Murderbot. I was really needed to do something else. I've talked about this before, but I had writer's block for the first 6 months of the pandemic. And so being able to write Witch King was really a big relief. And just, being able to do all the cool material culture stuff that I like to do in fantasy and get back to that just felt, it felt like having a vacation. Especially going back to the first book in a series, which always is the easiest because you have to remember what you did before and you can just make up all kinds of stuff. And then you get into the others and then you have to make all the kinds of stuff you've come up with make sense and hang together and all that. But it is, it's always going to be my first love probably.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you ever decide to make, like a book of fashion plates for the for the clothing in the Rising World series, I'm sure I'm not the only person who would be very interested.
Oh yeah, I would love to do that. I wish I was more of an artist. I used to be able to draw a long time ago, but I can't do it anymore. But yeah, I would love like a book of the actual what the actual clothes look like and everything, because that's been so much fun making that up.
Some of it is on the cover, which I'll a little bit in there. But maybe someone will hear this and say, "Martha, I got your back."
Cool. That would be cool.
Well, so we've got two last quick questions. The first one we kind of heard, but maybe you'll tell us more. What are you working on next at this point?
Right now, I'm working on the third Witch King book, which is going to be called Hierarch. And I already have finished. I finished another Murderbot. Oh, I don't know, sometime early in the year. It's so much has happened since then. I don't remember what it. But it's going to be coming out in May. And actually, the galleys for it. It's already gone through editorial, and the galleys for it are already out. Or the arcs, I mean, are already out. And it's called Platform Decay, and it's coming out on May 5th. Another Murderbot story. And then I'm working on Hierarch right now, and that's about it for now. I had another couple of short stories come out this year. I had a Murderbot short story, and I had Data Ghost, which came out in the Tanith Lee anthology. And it's actually, or the Tanith Lee tribute anthology Storyteller, and it's actually online right now on Pseudopod.
Oh, fantastic. So folks can go listen to that literally right now. And then the last easy one, which is, where can folks find you?
I'm on marthawells.com is my website. I'm on Blue Sky as marthawells.com. I'm on Instagram as Martha Wells Writer. And that's about it. I'm not on Facebook and I'm not on Twitter. And there are people pretending to be me in both places, and we can't really seem to do anything about it. But yeah, mostly Blue Sky. I'm also on Goodreads a little bit, but I don't actually. I just use it to keep track of my books. I don't actually participate very much. But yeah, Blue Sky and Instagram, and then and my Dream With blog, which is linked from my website. But that's it.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us, Martha, to talk about this book. And thank you for giving us your time twice now this year. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it both times. This has been great.
Yay, we brought joy. So, folks at home, if you would like, obviously you should buy this book and its preceding book. If you don't already have that one, buy it. And then buy it again and give it to a friend. And then buy it again and give it to another. Just keep doing it. Just do it until, I don't know, it's sold 10 million copies. Because, I don't know, I just want to see what would happen. Like, what would happen if 10 million copies sold? Like, what would the news stories be? I want to find out, so make it happen. But if you would like to let us know what you thought, skiffingfanty@gmail.com is one way you can do so. And then if you are in our Patreon Discord, there is a show discussion channel and a book discussion channel. So you can talk about this book and other Martha Wells books if you'd like. And then you can find us Blue Sky, Threads, Mastodon, YouTube, a whole bunch of places. That's skiffingfanty.com/skiffythings. You'll find links to all of that there. And then again, 7 p.m. Central every Friday, Twitch. That is twitch.tv/alphabetstreams. We are live there doing something. There's always something going on. So, I don't know, just come see us do other stuff. We interview people, and like we just did. So there you go. And then if you like the show, please, patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. Give us only the money you don't need to eat. Yeah, or for medication or anything important. Yeah, do not give us money if you need it for survival. Absolutely not. But if you've got $1 you don't need and you'd like to give it to us, we would welcome it.
Yeah. Well, I get to start the thank you to all of the Patreon supporters who are properly fed, sheltered, and medicated. Anyway, thanks to Andrea the Alluring, Cameron the Chthonic, Carolyn the Benevolent, Carrie the Divine, Chris the Candescent, Dan the Transient, Daniel the Cultured, David the Debonair, JC the Jocular, Jeff the Gracious, Joseph the Jovial, Juan the Junctional, KB the Kind, Karen the Kick-Ass, Kat the Kinematic, Matthew the Magnificent,
and Paul the Pious, Phoebe the Eloquent, Robin the Bold, Ryan the Resilient, Sarah A. the Sensational, Sarah E. the Sublime, Sarah O. the Rapturous, Scott the Gentleman, Stephen the Strange, Tari the Thorough, Tanya the Triumphant, Trish the Imperturbable, and finally, Victor the Valiant. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it. I'm SeanDuke.net. Alphabet streams here Wednesday, Sunday, 6 p.m. Central. Just put /Duke things on my website. You'll get all my socials.
And I am Sandra. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so thrilled to have been here. You can find me at sgwong.com. I'm mainly only also on Blue Sky, and that's also at sgwong.com.
Perfect. As required by the Skiffy and Fanty bylaws, I must make it happy. And so I have decided that I'm going to send an intention into this call at this moment, but it is a happy intention that everybody has a wonderful weekend and nothing bad happens. You eat delicious food and you get hugs if you need them and all of that good stuff. And that when you wake up on Monday, you are well rested and there's joy in your heart. And I know that's sappy and I don't care. And that's the intention I am sending, with, I don't know how exactly I do it, Martha, because I've never done that before, but there you go. So, and on that note, happy ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.